What comes next, both for FTX and just the implications for the broader industry?
Well, I think the biggest sort of disappointment here is really sort of, I guess, the shock of what happened with FTX and how quickly it unraveled. But when you think of, outside of sort of, I guess, the reputational damage, actually the number of people who are trading on FTX, for instance, are generally sort of expert traders, and they're usually people in the finance sector. The broad crypto segment itself isn't as affected when you particularly look at things like, for instance, people who are basically entering the space because of gaming or metaverse or so on. They're not the ones who are trading on FTX, for instance, right? The number of people that are sort of on the platform are sort of less than 1 million people, for instance. So I think the impact isn't actually as large as, for instance, what happened with sort of Terra and Three Arrows. But right now, I guess it's more of the image here because, SBF was actually someone who had a very high-profile reputation. So I think it's more of the reputational damage that is actually sort of more the sort of call it fundamental sort of financial damage in the same way as perhaps 6 months ago.
This is the issue, isn't it? Because Sam Bankman-Fried was seen as a white knight, a savior. Even as a lot of his peers to FTX collapsed, FTX seemed to be resilient. But has he really repeated the same problems that we've seen across crypto, which is the extreme leverage and the fact that it doesn't have the traditional, structures of resilience that traditional institutions and banks have?
I think what we've seen here classically, again, is a case of CeFi versus DeFi, meaning that here again, right, we have a case where actually it was the centralized sort of exchanges that failed because they didn't have to or didn't actually disclose the positions. They didn't, and in this case, it appears that there was extreme leverage that was unchecked. And effectively, you could call it a form of, whether it was intentional or unintentional, let's call it human fault and human error. And that is why, centralized exchanges do need to have more regulation. Now, what's interesting is that, once again, the decentralized marketplaces and exchanges actually functioned and just as intended, right? So, which basically happened the same 6-7 months ago. So there wasn't a problem there because everything was on chain. You could see all the actions that took place. And again, sort of the unraveling is the fact that actually one couldn't have the transparency that you have at decentralized exchanges. So I would say that what we see in DeFi actually worked. But of course, I guess, he was seen as that white knight. And for a lot of people who don't understand what's happening in crypto, they look at that and say, if someone like Sam Bankman-Fried can't be trusted, then who can you trust, right? And I think that's really the bigger damage than, again, the pure sort of, let's call it financial collateral damage, which I think was much greater, say, 6-7 months ago.
Which is why we're hearing from some traders that they no longer trust the exchanges and they're moving the tokens to offline wallets. Is that a trend that we're going to continue to see given the reputational damage?
Yes, so I think what you're seeing right now is that I think it's been not just a record sort of a number of sort of, particularly in terms of US dollars, so like USDC or USDT that's gone out of sort of the traditional exchanges and basically into self-custody. So this is also an interesting trend as well. It's a little bit sort of that trend of sort of, if it's not in your wallet, if you don't actually have custody over your tokens, then actually you don't have control over them. And I think that pattern has repeated itself. So there's more conversations around that.
When it comes to the blockchain, the technology itself, what could we see in terms of growth in other sectors that could actually help more mainstream use?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest thing that we're seeing at this moment in time is, for instance, if you look at the last year and a half, the largest adoption that we're seeing basically for blockchain has come from gaming and metaverse, right? This year, particularly, over $3 billion was invested in Web3 gaming. And, the trend is pretty clear, not just in terms of capital, but sort of the talent that's going into the space. The gamers, particularly in Asia, understand the value of, basically owning your digital stuff, as it were. And we'll continue to see that kind of adoption happening there. There's value in the gaming space, over $200 billion as an industry.